Hello everyone, and I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to discover an emotional story about an unfinished house, a powerful stormy night, and the moment Kiet's older sister finally witnesses how far he is willing to go to protect Tu Nha and little Pineapple. As rain pours through the broken roof and family tensions slowly rise again, will Kiet's family finally accept the life he chose, or will his father's disapproval destroy the fragile peace they've built together? Stay with us until the end to see how love, sacrifice, and family slowly begin to heal old wounds inside this tiny, unfinished home. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming videos. The morning after Kiet's mother visited the unfinished house, the atmosphere inside the small family felt strangely different. Nothing had truly changed on the surface. The walls were still unfinished, cement dust still covered parts of the floor, and the front yard remained crowded with broken bricks, wooden boards, and piles of sand waiting to be used. Yet somehow, the silence inside the house no longer felt as heavy as before. For the first time in a very long while, Tu Nha woke up without constantly feeling like an outsider inside someone else's family. Outside, morning fog drifted softly through the bamboo trees surrounding the small property, while Kiet had already been awake for hours. Barefoot and covered in cement dust, he stood in the yard, mixing cement inside a large metal basin, while little Pineapple sat nearby, playing with a broken plastic cup. Every few minutes, the little girl burst into laughter whenever Kiet accidentally scattered dust into the air while lifting the shovel too quickly. Her laughter echoed through the quiet countryside and somehow became the brightest thing inside their unfinished life. From the kitchen doorway, Tu Nha quietly watched the two of them while washing vegetables in an old aluminum basin. Even after everything that happened yesterday, she still could not fully believe Kiet's mother had treated her with kindness instead of rejection. The memory replayed repeatedly inside her mind. The older woman gently touching the unfinished walls, quietly holding Pineapple, asking about their lives without judgment. For years, Tu Nha had already prepared herself to be looked down on. A poor woman, a single mother, a burden. That was how most people saw her before meeting Kiet. Yet somehow yesterday had shaken something deep inside her heart. Outside, Kiet finally looked toward the kitchen and casually asked whether Pineapple had eaten yet, while wiping sweat from his forehead with his dusty arm. Tu Nha nodded softly before bringing breakfast onto the small wooden table. The meal was simple as always: rice porridge, boiled vegetables, and leftover eggs from the night before. But Pineapple still smiled brightly while swinging her tiny legs beneath the chair, as though the unfinished house around her was already a perfect home. While eating, Kiet suddenly mentioned that his mother had called earlier that morning. Tu Nha's hand froze around the spoon immediately. The atmosphere changed at once, and Kiet quickly noticed the fear returning to her face. He gently explained that his mother only wanted to ask whether they still needed anything for the house, and nothing bad had happened. Tu Nha nodded slowly, but her eyes still lowered toward the table, because fear like that did not disappear easily. Kiet quietly placed more vegetables into her bowl, the same way he always did whenever she became anxious. There were never dramatic reassurances between them, only small, silent actions that slowly held two exhausted people together. After breakfast, Kiet returned outside to continue repairing the front porch, while Tu Nha cleaned the kitchen with Pineapple, following closely behind her. The little girl dragged an old spoon across the unfinished cement floor, laughing every time the metal made noise against the ground. Hours passed quietly beneath the sound of construction work until sometime near noon, an unfamiliar motorbike stopped outside the bamboo gate. Kiet immediately looked up from the bricks in his hands, while Tu Nha stepped out from the kitchen, holding a wet towel before suddenly freezing in place. Standing outside the gate was Kiet's older sister. She removed her helmet slowly and silently observed the unfinished property around her. Unlike their mother, her expression was much harder to read. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Kiet finally walked toward the gate and carefully asked why she had come. His sister answered calmly that their mother told her to visit the house. The atmosphere immediately became tense again. Kiet opened the gate and invited her inside, while Tu Nha quietly lowered her eyes. Deep inside, her chest tightened painfully because she knew Kiet's sister had once sided with their father when he opposed the relationship. Pineapple suddenly ran toward Kiet, holding the same broken plastic spoon from earlier, and without hesitation, Kiet immediately bent down to carry her into his arms. His sister watched the scene carefully before quietly asking whether he took care of the little girl every day. Kiet simply nodded and answered naturally that Pineapple was family. The answer came too naturally for anyone to doubt. For several seconds, his sister remained silent because years ago, Kiet had been completely different. Irresponsible, careless, and constantly arguing with everyone around him. Even their own family never imagined he would someday spend his mornings carrying a child while repairing an unfinished house with his bare hands. Inside the kitchen, Tu Nha quietly prepared tea while trying to calm the anxiety growing inside her chest. She could hear fragments of conversation drifting from the yard, but avoided listening too closely until suddenly Pineapple's laughter filled the house once again. Instinctively, Tu Nha looked outside and saw Kiet's sister crouching beside Pineapple while offering her a small rice cake from her bag. The little girl accepted it immediately and laughed happily. The tightness inside Tu Nha's chest loosened slightly for the first time that day. Later that afternoon, dark clouds slowly gathered above the bamboo trees surrounding the house, while strong wind pushed through the unfinished walls. Kiet hurried to cover the cement bags with plastic sheets before the rain arrived, while Tu Nha quickly brought the drying chili peppers inside. Thunder echoed across the countryside before heavy rain finally crashed onto the unfinished roof. Water immediately began leaking through several small gaps, forcing Kiet to rush through the house, placing buckets beneath the dripping ceiling, while Pineapple clung tightly to Tu Nha's clothes in fear. Kiet's sister stood silently in the middle of the room, watching everything happen. Beneath the storm, the unfinished house suddenly looked even poorer. The leaking roof, the wet cement floor, the shaking wooden walls. Yet despite everything, nobody complained and nobody gave up. Kiet continued moving from corner to corner, trying desperately to protect the house, while Tu Nha quietly dried Pineapple's hair beside the kitchen. For the first time since arriving, Kiet's sister softly asked whether he truly planned to continue living like this. Rain pounded loudly above them, while Kiet paused for several seconds before quietly answering that for now, yes, this was their life. Then he looked toward Tu Nha and Pineapple and added softly that he would make things better someday. The room fell silent, except for the sound of the storm outside, and somewhere deep inside, the unfinished house, filled with rainwater, exhaustion, and cement dust, something inside Kiet's sister slowly began to soften. That night, the storm continued long after darkness covered the countryside. Rainwater dripped steadily through unfinished sections of the roof, while cold wind swept through the exposed brick walls and narrow hallway connecting the bedroom to the kitchen. Yet somehow, despite the storm outside, the tiny family remained gathered together beneath the dim yellow light inside the kitchen, as though nobody wanted to leave the fragile warmth they had created around each other. Kiet's sister sat quietly near the doorway, watching everything in silence, while Pineapple slept against Tu Nha's shoulder after crying from the thunder earlier. Nearby, Kiet crouched beneath another leak, holding a towel and plastic basin while trying unsuccessfully to stop water from dripping directly onto the floor. Tu Nha softly told him to rest for a while, but Kiet shook his head and quietly answered that if the water reached the cement bags, everything would be ruined. His voice carried exhaustion, but no frustration. It sounded like someone who had already accepted hardship as part of life. Kiet's sister lowered her eyes quietly because before today, she had believed the same things their father always said, that Kiet had ruined his future by choosing a difficult life with Tu Nha and Pineapple. But standing inside the unfinished house tonight, watching her younger brother run through leaking rainwater, trying to protect his family before thinking about himself, the image she once believed slowly began to break apart. The storm only grew stronger. Wind swept through the unfinished walls, while Tu Nha carefully carried Pineapple into the bedroom to move blankets away from another leak forming near the wall. Without hesitation, Kiet immediately followed her, carrying another bucket. His sister silently watched the two of them disappear into the dark hallway together. No words, no complaints, just two people instinctively protecting the same fragile life they had built together. For some reason, that silence affected her more deeply than any argument ever could. A little later, the electricity suddenly flickered before disappearing entirely, throwing the entire house into darkness. Pineapple stirred nervously, while Tu Nha quickly held her closer. Kiet immediately lit a small oil lamp from the kitchen shelf, and warm yellow light slowly spread across the unfinished room, casting soft shadows against the exposed brick walls and wooden beams above them. Beneath the dim light, the house somehow looked even smaller than before, yet strangely warmer at the same time. Kiet finally sat down for the first time in hours, his shirt soaked from rainwater and his hands still covered with dried cement. Tu Nha quietly handed him a towel, and their eyes met briefly. Even that small glance carried years of exhaustion, sacrifice, and understanding. Watching from across the room, Kiet's sister finally spoke softly, admitting that their father still believed Kiet would regret all of this someday. The room immediately became still, while thunder echoed outside. After several silent seconds, Kiet leaned back against the wall and quietly admitted that maybe he would regret everything if he ever abandoned Tu Nha and Pineapple. Tu Nha's fingers tightened around Pineapple's blanket, while Kiet calmly explained that before meeting them, he had wasted every day of his life. He spent money carelessly, argued with everyone, and lived without purpose until even his father stopped expecting anything from him. Then Kiet looked toward Pineapple, sleeping in Tu Nha's arms, and softly admitted that everything changed after the little girl started calling him Dad. Silence filled the room again, but this time it no longer felt uncomfortable. Kiet's sister slowly looked around the unfinished kitchen. The old aluminum pots, the damp cement floor, the leaking roof, and the strings of drying chili peppers hanging along the wall. None of it looked easy, comfortable, or secure, yet somehow for the first time she finally understood why Kiet refused to leave. Later in the night, Pineapple woke crying softly after another loud thunderclap, and before Tu Nha could even stand, Kiet immediately carried the little girl into his arms and gently whispered that everything was okay because he was there. Pineapple buried her face against his shoulder almost immediately. Beneath the dim yellow light, Kiet's sister quietly watched the scene before unexpectedly smiling for the first time that day. It was only a small smile, but completely genuine. Tu Nha noticed it immediately, and for the first time since entering this family, she no longer felt like someone standing outside, hoping to be accepted. Near midnight, the rain finally began weakening, while water still dripped slowly from the unfinished roof and buckets remained scattered across the floor. Exhaustion slowly replaced tension inside the small room. Eventually, Kiet's sister stood near the doorway, preparing to leave before the roads became too muddy by morning. But before stepping outside, she turned back toward her younger brother and quietly admitted that he had changed far more than anyone expected. Then she looked toward Tu Nha, holding Pineapple beside the kitchen, and softly confessed that their mother had been right. The unfinished house might still look incomplete, but somehow it already felt more like a real family than most finished homes ever could. As heavy rainstorms hit their unfinished countryside house, Kiet and Tu Nha struggle to protect the fragile life they have built together with little Pineapple. While water leaks through the roof and cold wind pushes through the exposed brick walls, Kiet works tirelessly through the night to keep his family safe. Tension rises when Kiet's older sister unexpectedly visits the house after hearing about their difficult life. At first, she silently judges the poverty surrounding them, but everything slowly changes as she witnesses Kiet caring for Pineapple like his own daughter and fighting to protect the unfinished home during the storm. For the first time, she begins to understand why Kiet chose Tu Nha over his old life. As the storm finally weakens, something inside the family quietly starts to heal, and the unfinished house slowly begins to feel like a true home, filled with love, sacrifice, and acceptance.